There we go. Oh, you're so slow. And we are under the wire. It's all good. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever part of the world you're in. But for those of you who are more or less in my part of the world, good evening. Hi, I'm Tad Williams. I am going to be reading some stuff tonight because that's what I do on Sundays. It's kind of my thing now. Anyway, so before I do, I'll check in and see who's already on the line already. James, hello, James. Good to see you. Kelly, you too. Nice to see you. Good evening. Tim, hey, how you doing? Nancy, hello, Nancy. Oh, I'm glad you liked the choice. Good, excellent. Emily, hello. And Jared, quoting Walt Whitman. You do remember that that's that poem is about somebody getting assassinated. Okay, just wanted to check. No sound. Okay, I should have sound here. Yeah, my microphone is all the way up. So that might be on your end. But anybody, if you're anybody else is not getting sound, let me know. But sorry to hear that, Kelly. Yeah, you might try try going off and going on again. I don't know. Maybe you just got a bad connection. Melardo. Buenos días, señor. Y bienvenido. Ron. Hi, Ron. It's always a pleasure to see you. Leah. Hello. Carl. Hello. Becca. Yay. Good to see you. Felina. Hi. I hope you had your time off yesterday and that it did you well. Jerry. Oh, Jerry makes a Jerry comment. Very good. Anyway, funny. Okay, Melissa. Hello, Melissa. Jeremy, my friend. Good evening. Good to see you. Claudia. Good evening. And Kenneth. Hi, Kenneth. Oh, Felina, that's nice to know. Tell your mom I said hi. Hello, Felina's mom. And Kelly. There you go. Okay, excellent. Glad to hear it. Brenna. Good evening. Yeah, insomnia is no fun, but it's nice if you can find something to do while you're stuck being sleepless. Barban, good to see you. James, wait, Tad, who? Good question. All right, Leah's got sound. Rand, hello, Rand. I haven't seen you before, but nice to see you. Sound is working. Is that a guillotine I see as your profile picture? I'm beginning to worry about the trend of this show. First we have a poetic tribute to assassination, and now we've got a guillotine. Have I been out of line somehow? Is there something somebody wants to tell me about? Actually, I don't know that it necessarily is a guillotine. It's very tiny, tiny on my screen. It might be one tower of the Bay Bridge or something, but I think it's a guillotine. Michael, hello, good evening. Okay, so we do seem to have sound. Katie, good evening to you too. And Sherry, a pleasure as always to see you. So, it's a political, no, I mean, that's fine. As long as it's not personally you guys letting me know that you're coming for me with torches and pitchforks. Not that it would be the first time that it's happened. Just ask some of my old neighborhoods. Anyway, good to see you all. And those of you who have not checked in and said it is a guillotine, says Rand. Just so that those of you have... Just so that those of you who have joined me know, but were not aware, I have started reading the first Shadowmarch novel. I'm not guaranteeing that we're going to go on past that one because Shadowmarch, of course, is 4 volumes. I have no idea at this point. I haven't read it. Well, it's about as long as War of the Flowers, so we might still be reading Shadowmarch, a year and something from now. But I'm certainly going to read the first novel, so I promise that. It's the 20th anniversary coming up. We started the Shadowmarch website then, which, among other things, besides driving us into the poorhouse, also helped to introduce us to a whole crew of people who are still friends and buds and correspondents and all that stuff today, scattered all over the world. Many of them have moots, M-O-O-T, moots, where they get together and hang out and talk about probably what an idiot I am. But that's okay. Anything that brings people together. As John Lennon said, come together right now over me. Hello, Kristen. Good to see you. And Becca, I'm very glad that you love Shadowmarch because that's what we're reading. So just a quick update for those who didn't get to see the last or listen to the last broadcast, which is that we started Shadowmarch. We read the intro. As somebody pointed out in the comments, I did skip over the fairly complicated section called A Brief History of Ion. In fact, just to give you an idea of what it's like and why I didn't read it as a straight off the bat thing, it's called A Brief History of Ion, with special attention paid to the rise of March kingdoms of the north, summarized by Finn Theodoros, scholar from Clemon's The History of Our Continent of Ion and Its Nations, at the request of his lordship, Avon Brone, Count of Land's End, Lord Constable of Southmarch, presented this 13th day of Eniamini in the year 1316 of the Holy Trigon. So that's the title. And because it's meant to be a bit of a gloss on historical writing of the Middle Ages in our culture, it is exactly what I mean. It's full of useful information if you're interested about Shadowmarch and the world it inhabits. And hey, Sean, good to see you, buddy. Yeah. Sean is a good friend of mine from here in the Bay Area, and a pleasure. I haven't seen him on these broadcasts before, so that's why I stopped to say hello. Anyway, so that is why I have not read that part, although at some point I will probably read it, but I'll wait maybe until we get a little deeper into it, because it is very dense with geographical and historical information, and it's not the kind of thing I wanted to start out with, just because it would be like 10-15 minutes or more, and we would have gotten even less far into the beginning of the story. But we did start the story. We read the introduction, which is a kind of overview, as told, as if witnessed in a dream, that goes to the land of the immortal or the fairy folk or the strange people. They are called in these books the Twilight people, who live beyond the Shadow Line. The Shadow Line is right near Southmarch Castle, which is the center of our activities or our storytelling, at least at the first part of the book. And on the far side of the Shadow Line, it is essentially fairy, and the kind of everything you could imagine sort of fairy, but dark and a bit grim. And we saw the blind king and the sleeping queen, as the blind king was dispatching what appeared to be a mortal child who was being taken out of the Twilight Lands and taken to where the mortals are and left there. We don't know why, we don't know, any of that stuff, but that's what we just saw. Then we began the story with twins, royal twins, because they are one of the sons and the daughter of the current ruling king, Bryony and Beric. Beric has a crippled arm, and they are on a hunt with their brother Kendrick, and we have discovered not only that they are hunting wyverns, which are things, dragon-like things, and in this case have wandered over across the Shadow Line, which in itself is not so weird. But we have also discovered that King Olin is being held captive. And so as a result, basically, the kids are in charge, or at least Kendrick is in charge. So that's where we are, and we are reading a section about Opal and Chert, Blue Quartz. Blue Quartz is their last names, who are Funderlings, who are small people, kind of similar to dwarves or hobbits in terms of size, not necessarily in terms of character. They're certainly more like dwarves. They're meant to be because they live underground. Anyway, and Chert and Opal have been out scavenging near the shadow line, because when the shadow line moves backwards and forwards a little bit, like the ocean tide, sometimes when it recedes again, there are little things left near it. And then Chert has made one frightening discovery, which is the shadow line is suddenly farther forward, or closer to Southmarch, farther into the mortal lands than it has ever been before. A few moments after having that realization, a group of riders, mysterious riders, have crashed out of the shadow line, out of the fog and mists, and have dropped a sack onto the ground and then have disappeared again. So I'm going to go back at last, just a little bit. One of the riders slowly turned toward the trees where the two Funderlings lay hidden. A glint of eyes in the depths of the shadowed hood, the only indication it was not empty. For a long moment the rider only stared, or perhaps listened, and although Chert's every fiber told him to leap to his feet and run, he lay as still as he could, clutching Opal so tightly that he could feel her silently struggling to break his painful grip. At last the hooded figure turned away. One of its fellows lifted something from the back of its saddle and dropped it to the ground. The riders lingered for a moment longer, staring across the valley at the distant towers of Southmarch Castle. Then, without a sound, they wheeled and rode their ghost-white horses back into the ragged wall of mist. Chert still waited, a dozen frightened heartbeats before he let go of his wife. "You crushed my innards, you old fool," she moaned, climbing up onto hands and knees. "Who was it? I couldn't see." I don't know. It had happened so quickly that it almost seemed a dream. He got up, feeling the ache of their clumsy, panicked flight begin to throb in all his joints. They just rode out, then turned around and rode back. He stopped, staring at the dark bundle the riders had dropped. It was moving. "Chert, where are you going?" He didn't intend to touch it, of course. No Funderling was such a fool to snatch up something that even those beyond the shadow line did not want. As he moved closer, he could not help noticing that the large sack was making small, frightened noises. "There's something in it," he called to Opal. "There's something in lots of things," she said, coming grimly after him. "But not much between your ears. Leave it alone and come away, you. No good can come of it." It's alive." A thought had come into his head. It was a goblin or some other magical creature banished from the lands beyond. Goblins were wish granters, that was what the old tales said. And if he freed it, would it not give those wishes to him? A new shawl. Opal could have a queen's closet full of clothes if she wished. Or the goblin might lead him to a vein of fire gold, and the masters of the Funderling guilds would soon be coming to Chert's house, with cap in hand, begging his assistance. Even his own so proud brother. The sack thrashed and tipped over. Something inside it snarled. Of course, he thought, there could be a reason they took it across the shadow line and tossed it away like bones on a midden. It could be something extremely unpleasant. An even stranger sound came from the sack. "Oh, Chert!" His wife's voice was now quite different. "There's a child in there. Listen, it's crying." He still did not move. Everyone knew there were sprites and bogles even on this side of the shadow line that could mimic the voices of loved ones in order to lure travelers off the path to certain doom. Why expect better of something that actually came from inside the Twilight Country? "Aren't you going to do anything?" "Do what? Any kind of demon could be in there, woman." "That's no demon, that's a child. And if you're too frightened to let it out, Chert of the Blue Quartz, I will." He knew that tone all too well. He muttered a prayer to the gods of deep places, then advanced on the sack as though it were a coiled viper, stepping carefully so that in its thrashing it would not roll against him and, perhaps, bite. The sack was held shut with a knot of some gray rope. He touched it carefully and found the cord slippery as polished soapstone. "Hurry up, old man!" He glared at her, then began cautiously to unpick the knot, wishing he had brought something with him sharper than his old knife, dulled by digging out stones. Despite the cool, foggy air, sweat had beaded on his forehead by the time he was able to tease the knot apart. The sack had lain still and silent for some time. He wondered, half hoping it was so, whether the thing inside might have suffocated. "What's in there?" his wife called, but before he had time to explain that he hadn't even opened the cursed thing, something shot out of the heavy sack like a stone from the mouth of a culverin and knocked him onto his back. Chirp tried to shout, but the thing had his neck gripped in clammy hands and was trying to bite his chest through his thick jerkin. He was so busy fighting for his life that he couldn't even make out the shape of his attacker until a third body entered the fray and dragged the clutching, strangling monstrosity off him, and they all tumbled into a pile. "Are you hurt?" Opal gasped. "Where is that thing?" Chirp rolled over into a sitting position. The sack's contents were crouching a short distance away, staring at him with squinting blue eyes. It was a slender-limbed boy, a child of perhaps 5 or 6 years, sweaty and disheveled, with deathly pale skin and hair that was almost white, as though he had been inside the sack for years. Opal sat up. "A child! I told you." She looked at the boy for a moment. "One of the big folk, poor thing." "Poor thing indeed." Chirp gently touched the scraped places on his neck and cheeks. "The little beast tried to murder me." "Oh, be still. You startled him, that's all." She held out her hand toward the boy. "Come here. I won't hurt you. What's your name, child?" When the boy did not reply, she fumbled in the wide pockets of her dress and withdrew a heel of brown bread. "Are you hungry?" From the fierce glint in his eye, the boy was clearly very interested, but he still did not move toward her. Opal leaned forward and set the bread on the grass. He looked at it, and her, then snatched the bread up, sniffed it, and crammed it into his mouth, scarcely bothering to chew before swallowing. Finished, the boy looked at Opal with fierce expectancy. She laughed in a worried way and felt in her pocket until she located a few pieces of dried fruit, which she also set on the grass. They disappeared even faster than the bread. "What's your name?" she asked the boy. "Where are you from?" Searching his teeth with his tongue for any fragments of food that might have escaped him, he only looked at her. "Dumb, it seems," said Chirp. "Or at least he doesn't speak our—" "Where is this?" the boy asked. What do you mean?" said Chirp, startled. "Where is this?" The boy swept his arm in a circle, taking in the trees, the grassy hillside, the fog-bound forest. "This place, where are we?" He sounded older than his age somehow, but younger too, as though speaking were a new thing to him. "We are on the edge of Southmarch, called Shadowmarch by some because of this shadow line." Chirp gestured toward the misty boundary, then swung himself around to point in the opposite direction. "The castle is over there." "Shadow line?" The boy squinted. "Castle? He needs more food." Opal's words had the sound of an inarguable decision rendered. "And sleep. You can see he's nearly falling over." "Which means what?" But Chirp already saw the shape of it and did not like it much at all. "Which means we take him home, of course." Opal stood, brushing the loose grass from her dress. "We feed him." But he must belong to someone, to one of the big folk families." "And they tied him in a sack and left him here?" Opal laughed scornfully. then they are likely not pining for his return. But he came from... Chert looked at the boy who was sucking his fingers and examining the landscape. He lowered his voice. He came from the other side. He's here now, Opal said. Look at him. Do you really think he's some unnatural thing? He's a little boy who wandered into the twilight and was tossed out again. Surely we, of all people, should know better than to believe everything that has to do with the shadow line is wicked. Does this mean you plan to throw back the gems you found here, too? No, he probably comes from some other place along the boundary, somewhere leagues and leagues away. Should we leave him here to starve? She patted her thigh, then beckoned. Come along with us, child. We'll take you home and feed you properly. Before Chert could make further objection, Opal set off, stumping back along the hillside toward the distant castle, the hem of her old dress trailing in the wet grass. The boy paused only to glance at Chert, a look the little man first thought was threatening, then decided might be as much fear as bravado, before following after her. No good will come of it, Chert said, but quietly, already resigned through long experience to whatever complex doom the gods had planned for him. In any case, better some angry gods than an angry Opal. He didn't have to share a small house with the gods, who had their own vast and hidden places. He sighed and fell into step behind his wife and the boy. The wyvern had been brought to bay in another copse of trees, a dense circle of rowans carpeted with bracken. Even through the milling ring of hounds, wild with excitement but still cautious enough to keep their distance, perhaps put off by the unusual smell or strange slithering movements of their quarry, Bryony could see the length of the thing as it moved restlessly from one side of the copse to the other, its bright scales glimmering in the shadows like a brush fire. Cowardly beasts, dogs, said Barrack. They are 50-1, but still hold back. They are not cowards. Bryony resisted the urge to push him off his horse. He was looking even more drawn and pale, and had tucked his left arm inside his cloak as though to protect it from chill, though the afternoon air was still sun-warmed. The scent is strange to them. Barrack frowned. There are too many things coming across the shadow line these days. Just back in the spring there were those birds with the iron beaks that killed a shepherd at Land's End. And the dead giant in Daler's Trough. The thing in the copse reared up, hissing loudly. The hounds started away, whining and yipping, and several of the beaters shouted in terror and scuttled back from the ring of trees. Bryony could still see only a little of the beast as it slipped in and out through the gray rowan trunks and the tangled undergrowth. It seemed to have a head, narrow as a seahorse's, and as it hissed again, she glimpsed a mouth full of spiny teeth. It almost seems frightened, she thought, but that did not make sense. It was a monster, an unnatural thing. There could be nothing in its dark mind but malevolence. Enough! Cried Kendrick, who was holding his frightened horse steady near the edge of the copse. Bring me my spear! His squire ran to him, face wan with dread, looking determinedly at anything except the hissing shape only a few paces away. The young man, one of Tyne Aldrich's sons, was in such terrified haste to hand over the spear and escape that he almost let the long, gold-chased shaft with its cross-haft and its heavy iron head fall to the ground as the prince reached for it. Kendrick caught it and kicked out at the retreating youth in irritation. Others of the hunting party were calling for spears as well. With the kill so close, the 24 immaculately coiffed and dressed noblewomen who had accompanied the hunt, most riding decorously on side saddles, a few even carried in litters. Their awkward progress had slowed everyone else quite a bit, to Bryony's disgust. Now took the opportunity to withdraw to a nearby hillock, where they could watch the end from a safe distance. Bryony saw that Rose and Moina, the two principal ladies-in-waiting, had spread a blanket for her between them on the hillside, and were looking at her expectantly. Rose Trelling was one of Lord Constable Brone's nieces. Moyna Hartsbrook, the daughter of a Helmingse nobleman. Both were good-hearted girls, which made them Bryony's favorites out of what she thought of as a mediocre stable of court women. But she sometimes found them just as silly and hidebound as their older relatives, scandalized by the slightest variation from formal etiquette or tradition. Old Puzzle, the jester, was sitting with them, restringing his lute, biding his time until he could see what food the ladies might have in their hamper. The idea of withdrawing to the safety of the hill and watching the rest of the hunt while her ladies-in-waiting gossiped about people's jewelry and clothes was too painful. Bryony scowled and waved at one of the beaters as he staggered past, with several of the heavy spears in his arms. "Give me one of those." "What are you doing?" Beric himself could not easily handle the long spears with only one arm, and had not bothered to call for one. "You can't go near that creature. Kendrick won't let you." "Kendrick has quite enough to think about." "Oh, God, curse it!" she scowled. Galen of Summerfield had seen and was spurring toward her. "My lady! Princess!" He leaned out as if to take the spear from her, and only realized at the last moment that he would be overstepping. "You will hurt yourself." She managed to control her voice, but barely. "I do know which end points outward, Duke Galen. But this is not fitting for a lady, and especially with such a fearsome beast." "Then you must make sure and kill it first," she said, a bit more gently but no more sweetly. "Because if it reaches me, it will get no farther." Beric groaned, then called the bearer back and took a spear for himself, clutching it awkwardly under one arm while still holding the reins. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "If you are going to be a fool, Strawhead, someone has to protect you." Galen Tolly looked at them both, then shook his head and rode off toward Kendrick and the hounds. "I don't think he's very happy with us," Bryony said cheerfully. From somewhere back along the hillside, she heard the Master of Arms shout her name, then her brother's. "And Shaza won't be either. Let's go." They spurred forward. The dogs, surrounded now by a ring of men with spears, were beginning to find their courage again. Several of the limers darted into the copse to snap at the swift-moving, reddish shape. Bryony saw the long neck move, quick as a whip crack, and one of the dogs yelped in terror as it was caught in the long jaws. "Oh, hurry!" she said, miserable but also strangely excited. Again she could feel the presence of invisible things swirling like winter clouds. She said a prayer to Zoria. The dogs began to swarm into the copse in numbers, a flood of low shapes swirling in the dappled light beneath the trees, barking in frightened excitement. There were more squeals of pain, but then a strange creaking bellow from the wyvern as one of the dogs got its teeth into a sensitive spot. The barking suddenly rose fiercely in pitch as the beast fought its way through the pack, trying to escape the confinement of the trees. It crushed at least one of the hounds under its clawed feet and gutted several others, shaking one victim so hard that blood flew everywhere like red rain. Then it burst out of the leaves and moving shadows into the clear afternoon sunlight, and for the first time Bryony could see it whole. It was mostly serpentine body, a great tube of muscle covered with glimmering red and gold and brown scales, with a single pair of sturdy legs a third of the way down its length. A sort of ruff of bone and skin had flared out behind the narrow head, stretching even wider now as the thing rose up on those legs, head swaying higher than a man's as it struck toward Kendrick and the two other nobles closest to it. It had come on them too quickly for the men to dismount and use their long boar spears properly. Kendrick waited until the strike had missed, then dug at the creature's face with his spear. The wyvern hissed and side-slipped the blow, but as it did so, one of the other men, Bryony thought it might be Tyne, the hunting mad Earl of Blueshore, drove his spearhead into the thing's ribs just behind its shoulders. The wyvern contorted its neck to snap at the shaft. Kendrick seized the opportunity to drive his own spear into the creature's throat, then spurred his horse forward so that he could use its force to pin the wyvern against the ground. The spear slid in through a sluice of red-black blood until the cross-haft that was meant to keep a boar from forcing its way up the shaft stopped it. Kendrick's horse reared in alarm at the thing's agonized, furious hiss, but the prince stood in his stirrups and leaned his weight on the spear, determined to keep the thing staked to the earth. The dogs swarmed forward again. The other members of the hunt began to close in too, all anxious to be in at the kill. But the wyvern was not beaten. In a sudden, explosive movement, the thing coiled itself around the spear, stretching its neck a surprising distance to bite at Kendrick's gloved hand. The prince's horse reared again, and he almost lost his grip on the spear. The monster's tail lashed out and wrapped around the horse's legs. The black gelding nickered in terror. For a brief moment, they were all tangled together like some fantastical scene from one of the ancient tapestries in the castle's throne room. Everything so strange that Bryony could not quite believe it was truly happening. Then the wyvern tightened itself around the legs of Kendrick's horse, crushing bones in a drum roll of frighteningly loud cracks, and the prince and his mount collapsed downward into a maul of red gold coils. As Beric and Bryony stared in horror from 20 paces away, Summerfield and Blueshore both began to jab wildly at the agitated monster and its prey. Other nobles hurried forward, shouting in fear for the Prince Regent's life. The crush of eager dogs, the writhing loops of the injured wyvern's long body, and the thrashing of the mortally injured horse made it impossible to see what was happening on the ground. Bryony was lightheaded and sick. Then something came up suddenly out of the long grass, speeding toward her like the figurehead of a Vuddish longboat, cutting the water. The wyvern, making a desperate lunge at escape, still dragging Kendrick's spear in its neck. It darted first to one side, then to the other, hemmed in by terrified horses and jabbing spears, then plunged through an opening in the ring of hunters, straight at Bryony and Beric. A heartbeat later, it rose before them, its black eye glittering, head swaying like an adder's as it measured them. As if in a dream, Bryony lifted her spear. The thing hissed and reared higher. She tried to track the moving head, to keep the point firmly between it and her, but its looping motions were quick and fluidly deceptive. A moment later, Beric's spear slipped from his clumsy one-handed grasp and banged sideways into Bryony's arm, knocking her weapon out of her hands. The wyvern's narrow jaws spread wide, dripping with bloody froth. The head lunged toward her, then suddenly snapped to one side as though yanked by a string. The monster's strike had come so close that when she undressed that night, Bryony found the thing's caustic spittle had burned holes in her deer-hide jerkin. It looked as though someone had held the garment over the flames of a dozen tiny candles. The wyvern lay on the ground, an arrow jutting from its eye, little shudders rippling down its long neck as it died. Bryony stared at it, then turned to see Shazo riding toward them, his war bow still in his hand. He looked down at the dead beast before lifting his angry stare to the royal twins. "Foolish, arrogant children," he said. "Had I been as careless as you would both be dead." Chapter 2. A Stone in the Sea. Weeping Tower. 3 turning, 4 standing, 5 hammer blows in the deep places. The fox hides her children. From the Bonefall Oracles. This was one of Vanson's favorite spots, high on the old wall, just beneath the rough, dark stone of Wolf's Tooth Spire, and also one of the most satisfying things about his given task. He had good reason to be up here in the stiff breeze that flew across Bren's Bay, with nearly all of Southmarch, castle and town, arranged beneath him in the autumn sun, like objects on a lady's table. Was it shameful that he enjoyed it so? When he was a child in the Dales, Ferris Vanson and the boys from the next croft had liked to play King on the Hill, each trying to hold a singular place at the top of some hummock of soil and stone they had chosen for their battleground. But even in those instants, when the others had gone tumbling down to the bottom and Ferris had stood by himself, master of the high place, still the foothills had loomed over them all, and beyond those hills the northern mountains themselves, achingly high, as if to remind young Ferris, even in triumph, of his true place in life. When he had grown older, he had learned to love those heights, at least those he could reach. At times he had purposely let the sheep wander off, trading one of his father's sometimes violent punishments for the pleasure of following the straying herd into the high places. Until his manhood he knew no greater pleasure than a stretch of afternoon when he could clamber up to one of the crests and look out over the folds of hillock and valley that lay before him like a bunched blanket. Deep, dark places and airy prominences that no one else in his family had ever seen, although they lay less than a mile from the family croft. Vanson sometimes wondered if this hunger for height and solitude the gods had put in him might not be stronger now than ever, especially with the much greater number of people around him in Shadowmarch, swarms of them filling the castle and town like bees in a hive. Did any of them, noble or peddler, soldier or serf, ever look up as he did and wonder at the loftiness of Wolf's Tooth spire, a black scepter shape that loomed over even the castle's other towers as the distant snow-capped mountains had dominated the hills of his boyhood country? Did any of the other guardsmen marvel at the sheer size of the place as they walked the walls, these two great uneven rings of stone that crowned Midland's Mount? Was he the only one secretly thrilled by the liveliness of the place? The people and animals streaming in and out through the gates from sunup until sundown, and by its grandeur, the antique splendor of the king's hall and the massive residence, whose roof seemed to have as many chimneys as a forest had trees. If not, Ferris Vanson couldn't understand it. How could you spend every day beneath the splendid season towers, each of the four a different shape and color, and not stop to stare at them? Perhaps, Vanson considered, it was different if you were born in the midst of such things. Perhaps. He had come here half a dozen years ago and still could not begin to grow used to the size and liveliness of the place. People had told him that Shadowmarch was as nothing compared to Tessus in Sion, or the sprawling ancient city-state of Hyrasol with its 200 gates. But here were riches to spare for a young man from dark, lonely Daler's Trough, where earth and sky were both oppressively wet most of the time, and in winter the sun seemed scarcely to top the hills. As if summoned by chill memory, the wind changed, bringing needles of cold air from the ocean that pierced even Vanson's mail shirt and surcoat. He pulled his heavy watch cloak more tightly around him, forced himself to move. He had work to do. Just because the royal family and, it seemed, half the nobles in the March kingdoms were across the water hunting in the northern hills, did not mean he could afford to spend the afternoon lost in useless thought. That was his curse, after all, or at least so his mother had once told him. You dream too much, child. Our kind, we make our way with strong backs and closed mouths. Strange, because the tales she had told to him and his sisters in the long evenings, as the single small fire burned down, had always been about clever young men defeating cruel giants or witches and winning the king's daughter. But in the light of day she had instructed her children, you will make the gods angry if you ask for too much. His Vutish father had been more understanding, at least sometimes. Remember, I had to come far to find you, he liked to tell Vanson's mother. Far from those cold, windy rocks in the middle of the sea to this fine place. Sometimes a man must reach out for more. The younger Ferris hadn't completely agreed with the old man, certainly not about the place itself. Their croft in the hill's dark, dank green shadows, where water seemed to drip from the trees more than half the year, was to him a place to be escaped instead of a destination. But it was nice to hear his father, a one-time sailor who by habit or blood was a man of very few words, talk of something other than a chore young Ferris had forgotten to do. And now, it seemed, Vanson had at last proved his mother wrong, for he had come to the city with nothing, and yet here he was, captain of the Southmarch Royal Guard, with the North's greatest stronghold spread before him, and the safety of its ruling family his responsibility. Anyone would be proud of such an achievement, even more men born to a much higher station. But, in his heart, Ferris Vanson knew his mother had been right. He still dreamed too much, and, what was worse and far more shameful, he dreamed of the wrong things. "He's like a hawk, that one," a soldier at the residence guardhouse said quietly to his companion as Vanson walked away, but not so quietly that Vanson didn't hear. "You don't ever want to rest for a moment because he'll just drop down on you sudden-like." Vanson hadn't even punished them when he found them with their armor off playing dice, but he had made his anger bitingly clear. Vanson turned back. The two guardsmen looked up, guilty and resentful. "Next time it might be Lord Brone instead of me, and you might be on your way to the stronghold in chains. Think about that, my lads." There was no whispering this time when he went out. "They can like you or they can fear you," his old captain Donald Murroy had always said, but even in his last years Murroy had not hesitated to use his knobby knuckles or the flat of his hand to reinforce that fear in a soldier who was insolent or just too slow in his obedience. Vanson had hoped when he was promoted to Murroy's place that he could substitute respect for fear. But after nearly a year, he was beginning to think the old Connord man had been right. Most of the guards were too young to have known anything except peace. They found it hard to believe that a day might come when stealing a nap on duty or wandering away from their posts might have fatal consequences for themselves or the people they protected. Sometimes it was hard for Vanson himself to believe it. There were days here on the edge of the world, in a little kingdom bounded by misty, ill-omened mountains in the north and the ocean almost everywhere else, where it seemed like nothing would ever change but the wind and weather, and those would only be the familiar small changes, from wet to slightly less wet, and then back to wet again, from swirling breeze to stiff gale, that so wearied the inhabitants of this small stone in the shallows of the sea. Southmarch Castle was ringed by 3 walls. The huge, smooth outwall of gray-white southern granite that circled the mount, and whose foundations in many places were actually beneath the waters of Bren's Bay, a skirt of fitted stone which, along with the bay itself, made the little sometimes island into what had been for centuries a fortress that could resist any siege. The New Wall, as it was called, though no one could remember a time before it had existed, that surrounded the royal keep and touched all the cardinal towers, except the one named for summer, and the Old Wall, that bounded the inmost heart of the keep, and within whose protective shadow lay the throne hall and the royal residence. These 2 edifices were as riddled with hallways and chambers as anthills, so old and vast and beset by centuries of intermittent neglect that they both contained rooms and passages that had not been entered or even remembered for years. The smaller buildings that surrounded them made the lower castle just as intricate a maze as the residence and throne hall. Jumbles of temples and shops, stables and houses, from the high timbered mansions of the nobility nestled inside the old wall to the stacked hovels of those of less lofty station, piled so leaningly high that they turned the narrow streets between them into shadowy arbors of dark wood and plaster. Most of the buildings of Southmarch had been connected over the years by a ramshackle aggregation of covered walkways and tunnels to protect the denizens from the wet northern weather and the often ruthless winds, so that sometimes all the castle's disparate structures, built over generations, seemed to have fused together like the contents of one of the tide pools in the rocks at the ocean edge of Bren's Bay, where stone and plants and shells grew together into one semi-living and no longer separable mass. Still, there was sun here, Ferris Vanson told himself, far more of it in a year than he had seen in his entire youth in the Dales, not to mention fresh winds off the sea. That made it all bearable, and more than bearable. There were times when just being in the place filled him with joy. By the time the afternoon had begun to fade, Vanson had walked most of the uneven circle of the old wall, stopping at each guard post, even those that consisted of nothing more than a lonely soldier with a pike, standing before a locked door or gate, and trying not to doze. Drunk on sea air, and some rare time to pursue his own thoughts without the distractions of command, Vanson briefly considered a course around the much lengthier new wall, but a look at the harbor and the sails of the newly arrived carrack from Hyrosol reminded him that he could not afford the time. There would be 100 tasks before the end of the day. The visitors must be safely lodged, guarded, and watched. And Avon Brown, and Avon Brown, the Lord Constable, would expect Vanson to take charge of that task himself. The ship had 4 masts, a good-sized vessel, which meant that the envoy might have come with a sizable bodyguard. Vanson cursed quietly. More than one day's pleasurable solitude was going to be sacrificed to this ship and its passengers. He would have to keep his men and the Southerners apart as much as possible. With King Olin a captive of Hyrosol's Ludus Dracava, there was much bad blood between the Hyrosolines and the Southmarch folk. When he came out of the small guard tower by the West Green, he was distracted from his planning by the sight of someone else on the walls, a cloaked and hooded figure that seemed slight enough to be a woman or a young boy. For an illogical moment, he wondered if it could be her, the one he dared not think of too often. Had fate somehow brought her here alone, to this place where they could not help but speak? The thought of all the things he might say to her, careful, respectful, sincere, passed through his mind in a heartbeat, before he realized that it could not be her, that she was still out with the others hunting in the hills. As though this swirl of confused thoughts made a sound as audible and frightening as a swarm of hornets, the hooded figure suddenly seemed to notice him. It immediately stepped down from the wall into the stairwell and disappeared from his sight. By the time Vanson reached the stairs, he could not discern that particular dark hooded cloak in the throng of people in the narrow streets below the wall. So, I am not the only one who likes the view from high places, he thought. He felt a pang. It took him a moment to realize, to his surprise, that it was loneliness. "You're too much inside yourself, Vanson," old Murroy had once told him. "You think more than you talk, but that's little use when the others can see so plainly what you're thinking. They know that you think well of yourself, and often not so well of them. The older men in particular, Laybrick and Southstead, that don't like it." I do not like men who take advantage," Vanson had answered, trying to explain what was in his heart, but not quite having the words. "I do not like men who take what the gods give and pretend it's their due." Hearing that, Murroy's leathery old face had creased in one of his infrequent smiles. "Then you must not like most men." Ferris Vanson had wondered ever since whether his captain's words were true. He liked Captain Murroy himself slightly more than he feared him, or at least he liked the man's brutal even-handedness, his unwillingness to complain, his occasional flashes of sour humor. Donal Murroy was staying that way to the end. Even as the wasting sickness stole his life, he offered no complaint against fate or the gods, saying only that he wished he had known what was going to happen so he could have given his wife's lying bragging younger brother a thrashing while he still had the strength. As it is, I'll have to leave it to the next man, whose hospitality or good sense he offends. I hope it's someone who has the time to beat him within a hair of his useless life. Vanson marveled at how the older man could laugh despite the racking cough and the blood on his lips and stubbled chin. How his shadowed, deep-sunken eyes were still as bright and heartlessly fierce as a hunting bird's. "You'll follow me, Asgard, Captain Vanson," said the dying man. "I told Brome. Himself has no powerful objections, though he thinks you a bit young. The great man's right, of course, but I wouldn't trust that ass Dyer with a bung from an empty cask, and all the older men are too fat and lazy. No, it's you, Vanson. Go ahead and muck things up if you want to. They'll just come and put flowers on my grave and miss me." Another laugh, another spray of red-tinged spittle. "Thank you, sir. Don't bother, lad. If you do it right, you'll spend all your life working at it with no more payment than a little land to build a house and perhaps a spot in a proper graveyard at the end of it instead of the potter's field." He wiped his chin with a gnarled hand. "Which reminds me, don't let them forget there's a place set aside for me in the guard cemetery. I don't want to end up out in the western hills somewhere, but I don't want Mikkel Southstead pissing on my grave either, so you keep an eye on me after I'm gone." He hadn't cried when the captain died, but he sometimes felt as if he wanted to when he thought about him now. The captain's manner of going had been much like that of Ferris's own father, now that he thought on it. He hadn't cried for Peter Vanson either, and hadn't been to his father's grave in the old temple yard at Little Stell for years. But that wasn't really so surprising. Vanson's sisters, what was left of the Crofters family, were all in Southmarch town now, settled with husbands and children of their own. Daler's Troth was several days' ride away in the hills to the west. His life was here now, in this dizzyingly large and crowded citadel. He made his way around to the western tower of the Raven's Gate. The men in the guardhouse there had a well-stoked fire, and he stopped to warm his hands before going to see what Lord Brode wanted done about the Southerners. The easy chatter had fallen off when he had come in, as usual, and all the men were standing around in awkward silence, except for Colum Dyer, the officer in charge and closest thing to a friend Ferris Vanson had. He dreaded the day he would have to draw that line Murroy had talked of so often, and discipline Dyer for something. Whatever Dyer felt about Vanson was certainly not fear, and did not quite seem like respect either, because he was certain that that would be the day that their friendship, slight as it was, would end. "Been out wandering the walls, Captain?" Dyer asked him. Vanson was grateful that Dyer at least named him by his rank in front of the men. That was a small nod of respect, wasn't it? "Any sign of invading forces?" Vanson let himself smile. "No, and Perrin be thanked for that today and every day. But there is a Hierosoline ship in the harbor, and there will be fighting men on board, so let us not take things too lightly either." He left them and made his way down the stairs to the sloping road that led up to the great hall. The Lord Constable had his work chambers in the maze of corridors behind the throne room, and at this time of the day Vanson felt certain he would be there. As he walked up the road toward the vast carved facade, where the guards were already straightening at their young captain's approach, he looked up at the high hall, nestled in the midst of the Mount's towers like a gem on a royal crown, and felt a clutch of worry that something might change, that some error of his own or the whim of feckless gods might take all this away from him. "I am a fortunate man," he told himself. "Heaven has smiled on me, far beyond what I have earned, and I have everything I could want, or nearly so. I must accept these great riches and not ask more, not anger the gods with my greed. I am a fortunate man, and I cannot, even in the foolishness of my secret heart, ever forget that." We have time to read a little bit more, so we will start Chapter 3. Proper blue quartz. The bird who is a riddle. These, by the way, these things at the beginning of chapters, it's easier to see. These are one of these things, it's harder to tell what's going on when someone is reading it to you, or, you know, it's being read out loud. Each chapter starts with an oracle, almost like the I Ching or something, an oracle from the Bonefall oracles. The bird who is a riddle. Oh, did I read the chapter title? Chapter 3, Proper Blue Quartz. The bird who is a riddle. Beak of silver, bones of cold iron, wings of setting sun, claws that catch only emptiness. From the Bonefall oracles. The boy from behind the shadow line stopped to stare at the castle's jutting towers. The three of them were on the lower reaches of the hill road now, which wound down through the rolling farmlands to the edge of the city on the shoreline. The heights of Midland's Mount were still distant across the causeway, Wolf's Tooth spire looming above all like a dark claw scratching the belly of the sky. "What is that place?" the child asked, almost in a whisper. "Shadowmarch Castle," Chert told him. "At least the part with the towers, out on that rock in the middle of the bay. The bit on this side is the rest of the town." "Yes, Shadowmarch. Some call it Shadowmarch. Did I already say that? On account of it so close to the..." He remembered where the boy came from and trailed off. "Or you can call it the Beacon of the Marches, if you like poetry." The boy shook his head, but whether because he didn't like poetry or for some other reason wasn't clear. "Big. Hurry up, you two." Opal had marched ahead. "But she's right. We have a long walk yet." The boy still hesitated. Chert laid his hand on the boy's arm. The child seemed strangely reluctant, as though the distant towers themselves were something menacing. But at last he allowed himself to be urged forward. There's nothing to be afraid of, lad," Chert told him. "Not as long as you're with us, but don't wander off." The boy shook his head again. As they made their way down from the hilly farmlands into the mainland town, they found wide Market Road, lined with people, almost entirely big folk. For a moment, Chert wondered why so many people had come out of their houses and shops to stare curiously at two Funderlings and a ragged, white-haired boy, then realized that the royal family's hunting party must have passed just ahead of them. The crowd was beginning to disperse now, the hawkers desperately reducing the prices of their chestnuts and fried breads, fighting over the few remaining customers. He heard murmurs about the size of something the hunters had caught and paraded past, and other descriptions. Scales? Teeth that made little sense unless they had been hunting something other than deer. The people seemed a little dispirited, even unhappy. Chert hoped the princess and her sullen brother were safe. He had thought that she had kind eyes. But if something had happened to them, he reasoned, surely folks would be talking about it. It took the best part of the fading afternoon to make their way through the city to the shore, but they arrived at the near end of the causeway with little time to spare before the rising tide would turn Midland's Mount back into an island. The causeway between the shore and the castle on the mount was little more than a broad road of piled stones, most of which would vanish under the high tide. But the place where it met the docks outside the castle gate had been built up by generations of fishermen and peddlers, until what hung over the water there was nearly a small town in itself, a sort of permanent fairground on the wind-lashed doorstep of Midland's Mount. As the Funderlings, his wife, and their new guest trudged across the piers and his wife and their new guest trudged across the piers and wooden platforms filled with flimsy, close-leaning buildings whose floors stood only a few cubits above the reach of high tide, dodging wagons and heavily laden foot peddlers hurrying to cross back over the causeway before nightfall, Chert looked out through a crack between two rickety shops across the mouth of Bren's Bay to the ocean. Despite the last of the bright afternoon sun, there were clouds spread thick and dark along the horizon, and Chert suddenly remembered the shocking thing that the arrival of the riders and the mysterious boy had driven from his mind. The shadow line. Someone must be told that it's moved. He would have liked to think that the king's family up in the castle already knew that they had taken all the facts into careful consideration and decided that it meant nothing, that all was still well. But he couldn't quite make himself believe it. Someone must be told. The thought of going up to the castle himself was daunting, although he had been inside the keep several times as part of Funderling work games, and had even led a few, working directly with Lord Ninor, the Castellan, or with his factor in any case. But to go by himself as though he were a man of importance. But if the big folk do not know, someone must tell them, and perhaps there will even be some reward in it, enough to buy Opal that new shawl, if nothing else, or at least to pay for what this young creature will eat when Opal gets him home. He regarded the boy for a moment, horrified by the sudden realization that Opal might very well intend to keep him. A childless woman, he thought, was as unpredictable as a loose seam in a bed of sandstone. Hold now, one thing at a time. Chert watched the clouds hurrying across the ocean, their black expanse making the mighty towers suddenly seem fragile, delicate as pastry. Someone needed to tell the king's people about the shadow line. There was no arguing it. If I go to the guild, there will be days of argument. Then Cinnabar or puffed-up young Pyrite will be appointed messenger, and I will get no reward. Nor will you get the punishment if you're wrong, he reminded himself. For some reason, he again saw before his mind's eye the young princess and her brother, Bryony's frightened gaze when she thought she had run him down, the prince's face as troubled and impersonal as the sky out beyond the mount. And he felt a sudden warmth that almost, if it had not been so ridiculous, felt like loyalty. They need to know, he decided, and suddenly the idea of what might be coming closer, behind that line of moving darkness, pushed anything so abstract as the good graces of the royal family from his mind. There was another way to pass the news, and he would use it. Everyone needs to know. And that's where we're going to stop, because that's the end of the section. And so, anyway, once again, we have reached the end of another long stretch of Tad indulgence, and I thank you for that indulgence. And, it's like having a little surprise party, except it's not a surprise every week. 2 of them. It's lots of fun. Anyway, so I want to hope you're all doing well and ask you to keep taking care of yourselves and the people around you and anybody that needs your help. I will be back next Sunday with more of Shadowmarch as we will begin to get into the nitty as well as the gritty of all the various plots and things and darkness and looming disaster and surprises and all that stuff. Although those of you who read the book before probably won't be as surprised as those who don't know the story by any of the surprises, because that's the nature of surprises, do you see? Once you know them, they're not really surprises anymore. This bit of explication of a crucial fact of fiction writing I provide for free. Surprises are only surprises until you're surprised, and then after that, they're unsurprising. Okay. With that, I say good night. Thank you for indulging me. Be good to yourselves. Everybody, next Sunday. Yeah, 7 p.m. and also 2 a.m. 2 a.m. first, 7 p.m. after that. Okay. I think we did everything here. I'm confused and I'm hungry. I'm going to go upstairs and see if the dog was barking at some kind of delivery person who has brought food into our humble household.